Today, Chuck and Brock talk about mental representation, Chapter 25, by Professor Panaccio, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy. This is Generous Theology.
Absolutely. Great analysis. And the interesting consequence of this is let's just consider me describing myself to a friend. And I happen to share with this friend that I'm 25, and it's very important for me that my friend recognize my 25-edness. And if that seems unusual, of course, what we think about is that it's not so unusual after all, if we're talking about some of these controversial issues of identity. Without looking for a fight in the culture wars, I did just recently have a dear close friend come and tell me about their identity. And he indicated that he's feeling non-binary, that he's feeling trans. And that's so important to him that he's considering lifestyle changes that may reflect that. Now, here's where it hurts. If Abelard is right and our mental image is ultimately a fictum, doesn't that have moral implications for my friend who's debating over whether to transition genders? And if it's not, if it's something more than fictum, and in fact, if it's even more primary than the underlying ontological reality, then why am I not 25? And I'm not just taking that example to be flippant. I had discussions with my late mother. She died in her 70s, near the end of her life. She said to me, I don't feel old. She said, I feel like a teenager trapped in an old person's body. And so when she was talking with me, was I talking with a teenager or was I talking with a grandmother in her mid-70s? What's the truth and what's the reality? That's the kind of issues that this chapter deals with, that these mental representations touch. So this is one of the reasons why I said this was such a crucial chapter for modernity, for discussions that we're having today. So that was a lot to throw out there, Chuck. How would you run with it from here?
No, I think that it is a necessary discussion, and it's an important way to think about it, because even it goes the other way as well. If the only reality is the mental image and the physical image is entirely fictum, or at least it is something that in and of itself cannot be comprehended, and until we've created the reality through our perception of it, that also has moral implications, I think. And so it is an important discussion to have. And I think then comes, okay, regardless of whether one makes essentialism or existentialism primary, whether one makes the physical image or the mental image primary, what is the role of the other? And what is the importance of the other? And all of those are going to play a role. And in fact, even without coming to a solution, I think there's some importance in even understanding that these are very different perspectives that people are going to hold. And there is a sense in which I think people on both sides of this essentialist, existentialist divide are unable to see the other and unable to understand it. And the perspectives of that other side seem almost ridiculous, seem absurd. And because folks on each side of things think the other is absurd, there is no ability to even discuss. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that some could think that what I'm suggesting is that the answer is a Kantian dialectic where you synthesize a new idea out of the two old. I'm not sure that you can take essentialism and existentialism and create a new synthesis of these two ideas into something. But there is a sense in which there would be, I think, some benefit to having this philosophical discussion and getting at sort of the philosophical underpinnings before we even deal with the day-to-day results that come from it. And your trans friend is one example of that, but I think there are all sorts of others, and some of them that maybe even be a little bit more difficult to deal with, right? Because at least with gender, you can take a look at chromosomes and those kinds of things, and they tell us something. When you start dealing with race and other things like that, how much of that is construct, and how much, and therefore, how do we deal with those kinds of issues? And perhaps that's why, too, that there's often different perspectives perceptions of people who may sort of identify on certain issues like race versus gender versus other things, because I suspect that in between hardcore essentialism and hardcore existentialism, there is this mishmash where people tend to be essentialist on certain things and existentialist on others, and not always in a way that makes entirely rational sense. And we have to figure that out as well. So it is I'm glad you brought it up, because I think it is a really important discussion to have. And it's a discussion that we need to have in a way that recognizes that we may come at it with very clear opinions on it, and opinions that may not necessarily change, but also an understanding even of the side effects and why it, and I think you put your finger on something here, that some of the cultural changes we're seeing are perhaps the inevitable result of some of these shifts in the way we think about it. And it may be that those who wish to change the perception of others need to think about the way to do that probably is more than just simply arguing about particular issue, arguing about sexuality and gender and those kinds of things, and is just as much a philosophical issue of how do we perceive, and what is it that we're perceiving, and what is the mental image that we're creating, and what is the primacy of that mental image vis-a-vis physical thing that we are seeing or perceiving, sometimes in other senses or other ways of knowing. So yeah, it's a really good and important discussion.
It almost makes me want to think about what some people have maybe thought of as a fundamental distinction between humanism and non-humanism. And so, at the risk of oversimplifying, some people have made some conceptual hay by postulating that there are really two major differences in philosophy, and that would be humanism versus non-humanism. We could put it the other way. We could say Christian theism versus everything else. We can do the A and not A partitioning of a set. We can draw the line in several different places, but Protagoras famously said, humankind is the measure of all things. And so there does seem to be a tie-in between this human-centered position. I don't know if humanism is quite the right thing, except that, of course, it's been classically associated with humanism. Maybe we could expand that to consider any and all anthropologically centered ideas of value and meaning versus the schools of thought that are externalistic, that are objectivistic. In other words, ultimate meaning, the grand narrative, the meta-narrative of reality is outside of us and independent of our personal beings in some ultimate or final sense. And so you don't want to go more binary than you have to, but this is a really helpful rubric in understanding why people tend to claim the sorts of things that they want to claim. And at the risk of pushing the controversy, which I'm not intending to push controversy, but on the other hand, I don't want to run from the implications of it either. Do we feel the same, for example, about our bank accounts? Chuck, I have gone down to the bank and I've made several deposits, and the institution has a record of certain specific amounts going into my account on certain days. But if my mental representation is primary over that external reality, then if the bank only thinks I've deposited $518, but in my reality, my mental representation of it, I've deposited $518 million, we can see how this could be a very advantageous fictum. This could be a very useful fiction for me to try using. And in fact, what is money? You will find amongst economists, again, it's too simple to say there are only two schools, but you make a lot of hay and you gain a lot of ground by considering this very sharp partition. Those who make money a mental representation primarily versus those who give it a grounding in reality. And so that's just another example of where this can go. So can I have a mental representation of myself as 25, even though I'm in my 50s? And can I imagine that I have $518 million in my bank account, even if I've only ontologically deposited 518? like you said, if it's all one or the other, it's extremely absurd. The other position is clearly incorrect. And yet, what will we do with this? In the wrestling match for what has the primacy, where should we look? Where should the grounding be? Where ought the grounding to be, and why? And that's almost perhaps the whole battle in philosophy. And so I don't know if I moved the ball forward in the way you were looking to take it, Chuck. Did I do that, or should we try to redirect that, or what were you thinking?